We the Tartarians.
And at one point we talked about this guy, Henry Darger, who was a foundling who'd written this 15,000 page book, longer than anyone has ever written, called The Realms of the Unreal, all about these wars that were fought in Tartaria by little girls against evil men. And he called this book The Realms of the Unreal. And we have to wonder if these were just actual stories that were lost from the war that was fought in 1812, and he's just writing down things that had happened that are forgotten about just before his childhood. But unless he was told these things from someone, it would have had to have been in his collective consciousness, which is not necessarily some magical term. It's just the idea that he would have studied and read, absorbed all sorts of images from his time period, and digested it by creating a reality out of these images that made sense. Because it doesn't take a computer or the Matrix in order to use your senses for your imagination. In order to switch the stimuli for your senses from the real world, and that's actually where you get the word interstellar from, because it means the subject within or revolving a subject or luminary. And there are a lot of these really ancient pictures of star maps, and they describe how to travel, how to astral project for an astronaut in order to meet extraterrestrials, and there are pictures of them, and they have names and customs and spheres of influence. But perhaps it would be unwise to ask them to take you to their leader, because often sometimes just writing something misunderstood down might visualize it, realize it, reveal it, lift the veil. And whether or not it was a personal account of something that he'd experienced, and whether or not he knew it was true, he might be revealing the truth, or making it truth, or making it real. And an example is John Dee's septogram, which is the 7-pointed star, and you've probably often seen this on the side of a police car, but it's used in order to trap a 6-pointed star, that is to say, another spirit with inside of it. Often a sage will stand in one star fort in front of another, between 4 corners, in order to make contact. And I'm sorry I showed you that, and I probably shouldn't show you anything else. And the thing I was going to show you, I'm just going to not show you, because I probably just invoked a demon or awareness, and because maybe this stuff isn't real, but just in case you don't want to mess with this stuff, a multi-dimensional awareness. And as skeptical as you and I might be, that's just high risk and little reward. But just really quickly to recap, this is space travel, really quickly. This is flat space, this is space travel, and this is a spaceship, and the personal seal of Solomon. But the crazy thing to remember about this is what scientists actually believe, or at least the ones that are in the know. And it's both unavoidable and essential to their entire paradigm. In fact, you can't exist without it. And it's more than just a lot of money that's riding on all of this. But if you really want to know this or need to know this, they'll teach it to you, but they teach it to you backwards. And you start from the models, from the answers from their equations, and then you start to work yourself deeper and deeper into a scientific hole. And the academics call this depth in a particular field a proficiency. In fact, it's taught that it's virtually paradoxical to have a broad education as well as depth in a particular field. So in order to learn the particular secrets that one is passionate about, it's a prerequisite that the scientists accept the mystery. It would look completely insane. Despite it being geometry and math, it's so far removed somehow from what they're used to seeing, from the way that they're used to looking at it, that they're going to have to work backwards if they want to find their way to the truth about what they already know. Because this is what scientists actually already believe, and if they were going to backtrack, it's a little late now, that due to the math, which they believe in with utter devotion, and respect and fear for its unquestionable potency, that all places and all moments within space-time are occurring simultaneously and are symmetrically dependent upon each other due to the osmotic law of equivalency. And we can speculate, due to the law of parallelism, or Amdahl's law, that regardless of the number of simultaneous threads of calculations, due to the actual amount of time it takes to solve at least one equation, it also hints at evidence for the probability of the existence of at least one lifetime shared by all life simultaneously in a woven tapestry of hyperthreads of parallel processing. But that math is also simultaneously comforting because it suggests that, again, we are not living in a simulation, and perhaps we are the divine processes of some celestial calculator. However, this stacked perception concept is interesting because if we are to reframe either our spiritual or scientific hubris through a shared awareness, then that new perspective requires mathematicians and spiritualists to compare notes in order to reveal new interpretations and perspectives beyond our shallow perceptions of the impacts they make on us. Because it takes both to reveal the secret mysteries and our measurements about them, and the impressions they make on our world and us. And this is why we use simple, plain geometrics, so we can articulate and describe things on different levels, measuring the different depth of qualities and attributes. And in geometry, that's where we get planate objects. Planate objects. Planate objects. Which is a correlation of a description of an absolute value metric. And it's a lot of binary games of 20 questions. Basically, you have counting of qualities. Is this pixel black? Is this pixel green? Is this pixel red? Is this pixel blue? Over and over again. And in a binary quantitative system, the answer is yes or no. Whereas in a qualitative study, it's more flexible and a pattern can be examined in principle rather than in absolutes. Because binary is a very is you ain't, yes or no, black or white, one side of the line kind of question. Binary information can be strung together into qualitative research, but it really requires calculations with definite articles of identities rather than variables, unless those variables are elsewhere defined by their impacts on other systems. And that is the big difference between binary and analog, the difference between is it one or how much not. The difference between is the bell ringing and how much difference is there between now and when the bell will ring. Analog qualitative metrics of binary quantitative calculated definitions can be ranged in order to chart and describe, because even if these articles are disconnected, their mutual shared awareness transcends them and connects them together. But in order to exist within that paralleled system, it is necessary for that awareness to be limited in order to calculate the variable's existence in one instant at one time, in one place. And that's the big paradox of the Heisenberg uncertainty principle, that the more you know about an electron, the less certain you are about its orbit and path. That the more you know about the qualities of an electron, the less you understand where it's going. And again, scientists actually know this because it is exactly that limited awareness which makes it possible for them to exist in these momentary instances and still tie them together. Because despite some fantastic mathematical theories, conventionally it's all but impossible for an old man to become a young girl, or vice versa, or a baby to become a falcon, or a dolphin to become a spider. And in fact, it seems like there's less irrationality and more causality to the sequence of events from one incarnation to another, as if to conclude that somehow our actions have some sort of effect on our future. Now, I know it might seem almost impossible for someone from our civilization to believe that actions have consequences, but there actually is a lot of math behind the concept. Not just generations of experience. Not just the entire history of all the world's experiences combined. But regardless of our limited awareness, scientists are all but certain that despite the way we experience reality, due to the very architecture of the physics which they believe govern their reality, and their absolute value metrics which they use to describe them, our perspective of reality might be less about that the appearance of reality might be another construct. There is another way of looking at reality besides the more generally perceived paradigm of reality, and a completely other model than the one that's used for describing orbitals, that explains the actual identity of the particle, that identifies the identity of the position rather than the momentum. And all infinity stacked out holographically on top of itself would look something like this, in the pureness of the instant, if we were to be here now, and not just existing between the pillars of superego and ego in the past and the future, but actually the present. This might be science's best model for a holographic moment. And for those who are watching who still believe in the globe, but want a safe place to dive off into and explore, nestled safely in the paradigm of flat space. And before you run off screaming that this is where you draw the line and that you know better, or that you have experience, and that you went to school to know how to adjust for the curvature, take a deep breath. I'm not trying to gaslight you. Take a deep breath, because it's not some sort of a psyop, because I've done my best to explain to you why this is not as silly as it sounds. And that due to the nebulous of space, this is just as good of a model as any. The instant is as good a model as the orbital, if perhaps better. But not to provoke you, I'll just remind you, you don't really adjust for curvature. You're adjusting for maps. And you already know this, and because on a prime meridian map, you have to readjust for this quote-unquote curvature. But you could really just use a polar projection. I have. And you'd be surprised how many paragliders and private pilots carry a flat Earth map in their apps. Because it's just easier than using the map they know to be true, which requires them to use crazy amounts of math and very specific tools. And the thing is, if you're not just educated, but you actually are an expert, experienced in these things, then you already know that this is true. And if you really think about it for a second, it's not going to mess up the rest of your life. You've been living on the same Earth the entire time. And if you really think about it for a second, it'll startle you how little it matters, because you've been able to live your entire life without it mattering, regardless of proving one model's exclusivity and supremacy. Because either way, it takes the same education and the same skills in order to enforce one paradigm or the other. Unless, you're the other guy, and you really don't know what's going on, and you totally think that it's true because it's been explained to you by someone you trust. And so why would you bother doing your own experiments? Because why would you believe the experience of experts wasn't conclusive enough for you? Because often these days, experts are not, or at least they're not experts in the tools. The real pilots that are more than just bus drivers in the sky know the difference between the tools, and like GPS, which by the way does not stand for global or satellite, doesn't stand for global positioning satellite, in case you thought that. It's actually geographic positioning system, and it's made of a slew of classified patents from the Masters of Space, designed by the Department of Defense, and was originally developed for the military. And the interesting thing about the geographic positioning system is that the infrastructure does not require a satellite. It can actually work entirely with base stations and cellular radio, as well as planes and drones. But it'll never be the same or nearly as good as a good old-fashioned measuring compass. And before you get too afraid of this pointy metal stick, let me remind you again of 1 Thessalonians 5:21. To test all things, but hold fast to what is good. Well, to be honest, I can't actually think of anything more valuable than a tool when it comes to proving or disproving anything at all. The beliefs in the experience and the ignorance of the experts. So don't be too afraid of the compass, because it's not a Ouija board. Or, well, not exactly. Because obviously it's not the same as just another system of control. The compass allows for the charting of stars and the mapping of sacred geometrical shapes. And perhaps the compass might be the single most important external tool for space travel. And not just for the building of rocket ships or DeLoreans. You see, the studies of astronomy were very popular in the 19th century, and at the time the planete objects of space had no plane-face photographs as have been presented by NASA, and instead the solar planete objects were observed only through eyes and telescopes. And in fact, these planete realms were considered luminaries, not spheres, but deities, each with their own realms and realities and planes of existence, unable to be experienced by the mortals of our reality, except the astronauts, who could meditate and with the proper maps could visit. But space is a busy, deep place, easy to get lost in, and there are countless stories of forever lost astronauts, never able to make it back home. So it's really important to have the right maps and the right tools to get your way back. And there's lots of stories of the star portals, the Stargates, the doorways from one dimension to another. There's movies and TV shows and books, but it actually goes back way further. In fact, the idea of light or radio waves hitting crystals and creating patterns like stars is pretty much universally accepted. I don't think anyone's arguing. But it seems then worth speculating that this transmission of radio waves is some sort of data, and that stars to Stargates could be optical radio transceivers. In fact, to sum up with Saturn, something pretty weird about Saturn. Saturn's polar regions are hexagonal, and in fact, a number of planets, including Uranus and Neptune, as well as many moons, have octagonal Stargate poles. And since we're comparing contemporary physics and science to antiquated mysticism, and we are startlingly finding so many similarities, since we talked about science first, but also because it's a relatively newcomer as far as empirical philosophies go, and as we've seen is just as much, if not more, based on speculations, and technically, to be fair, because I do think that the mystical tradition may have come first, it might be worth mentioning a bit more of its narrative, in case science decides to find out any more of these ancient mystical traditions turn out to be cold, hard facts. So the thing about these planete objects that we're measuring in plane geometry, in absolute value metrics in order to count their qualities and create quantitative and qualitative metrics, so that we can escape our limited awareness and expand and transcend our confined paradigms. A big thing these ancient mystics said about the luminary planate objects is that their spheres of influence were ordained by being wandering falling stars, and that these asteroidal realms are actually the realms of the fallen luminaries. And in reality, the soul, our system, more than just surrounds us, it penetrates us. And in the physicist's holographic paradigm of flat space, because the farther out you want to seek, the deeper in you must go. And so they focused on visiting these realms of space through the astronautics by tuning their senses to focus on their imaginations instead of the surroundings. And so they could travel to these far off realms inside themselves. But without a metal craft like a submarine or DeLorean, you couldn't really bring much besides yourself, so it wasn't very practical for colonialism or conquests. And I wanted to tell the parable of Krang. And he's a villain from the mythos of the mutated ninja tortoises of the 10th Age. And it's a contemporary legend and mythology, but its legends are rooted in antiquity. It was originally conceived as a comic book by Peter Laird and Kevin Eastman, and was inspired not by New York, but actually by Philadelphia's experiments, where notorious military experiments were conducted, causing the disappearance and reapparition of both the sailors and the vessel, albeit haphazardly and embedded into the sides of the boats, and neither instantly nor perfectly. Men were reportedly found on fire and embedded into the sides of the boats, screaming until they were dead, until the vessel was again consumed by lightning and once more disappeared. The pulp of conspiracies, of course, is that the vessel transposed our reality and entered another one of the realms. And inspired by this concept, these comic book writers created the Ninja Turtles, about the teenage ninjas who happen to be amphibian. And aside from the notorious details that these pizza-loving protagonists happen to be classically trained amphibian ninjas in their youth, still in their adolescence. An often overlooked fact is that the villain of the story is not actually Shredder, the adversary of their master Splinter, but this horrifying, mucus-ridden, pink, spike-toothed brain named Krang. And while at first glance to a passerby or grown-up, admittedly the illustrations have been downplayed in order to present a more tame and less objectionable facade. But Krang is actually a being from Dimension X. Actually, he's just the brain of a being from Dimension X. His true body is lost in Dimension X. It's a giant, towering reptilian monster. It's a giant, towering, large and imposing and reptilian, and Krang's basically Godzilla. But he's lost his giant body from Dimension X, either by some sort of punishment or from a consequence of war, and through an atomic blast was teleported via another atomic portal during World War II in Hiroshima, Japan. And something really weird about Hiroshima is that a lot of people survived because they were eating miso soup. After they found out, because a lot of the doctors, they asked, why aren't you dying of radiation poisoning from treating all these people? And they said, I have no idea. The only thing we're doing, because we don't have anything else, is eating miso soup. And it turned out that the enzymes within miso are able to consume heavy metals and radioactive toxins. And that's such a marvelous coincidence that due to the mathematical improbability, there actually is a theory that the pre-existence of miso in Japan in the past is a direct consequence of a nuclear incident from the future. And though we cannot directly observe this to be true, we can perceive this from data. We can deduce this from compelling evidence of data. So out pops Krang into Hiroshima, Japan, and a whole lot of other stuff. And Krang is wandering around Japan and just his brain, and he finds Orokusaki, the adversary of their master Splinter. And Krang finds a member of the Yakuza, and he offers to make Orokusaki and the Yakuza very rich by offering him technology from Dimension X. All the technology he could ever want. All in return he requires is that Orokusaki builds him a body. So that he can dominate, so he can conquer the world and stuff. So that he can conquer the Earth and he can return back to Dimension X in order to return home so he can dominate Dimension X. And Master Shredder, Orokusaki, is all like, yeah, sure, I'm gonna build you a body. Just as soon as I return some videotapes. But he lures Krang along long enough to get more and more technology until eventually Krang says, no more, that's it, no more technology until you build me a body. And so finally Orokusaki builds Krang a body, and Shredder becomes another stooge and tool of this reptilian brain from Dimension X.
Recent Tartarian.